let me go ahead and welcome to the platform a new friend, Pastor Dave Eckert. Give him a hand.
Thank you all for having me here with you out in Clarion County. I am from just outside of Philadelphia, Montgomery County. What I'm going to be talking with you about today is better together, why we are better together. There's a part one and a part two. The part one is the why churches, providers, and government must collaborate. After our break, we'll get into the how we do this. Now, I want to share a little bit about myself, and it will help you, I think, understand where I'm coming from with what I share with you. I work for a place called Access Services. Access is a social service organization serving 14 counties in southeastern Pennsylvania. We serve in the behavioral health field, the intellectual disability field, housing and homelessness. And so I've been working there in adult mental health since 2001. So since 2001, I've been working specifically in the field of mobile psychiatric rehabilitation, so helping adults with mental health struggles to live independently in the community. Now, as I was doing that work in 2007, I was also asked by my church to come on staff. So I've been a pastor since 2007. So through much of my adult life, I've been walking in two worlds: the world of the public mental health system and the world of the church. And when you walk in those two worlds, as I think some of you do, you learn a couple things. The first thing you learn is that the public mental health system often does not know how to navigate the spiritual dimension of people. At the same time, you learn that oftentimes the church isn't always sure how to minister to people with mental health struggles in our congregations. And it was walking in those two worlds and seeing those realities, learning those lessons over and over and over again, led in 2017. I heard Trent talking about a symposium in 2017. So maybe God was up to things in 2017. In 2017, out of these two worlds I was walking in, I started an initiative called Intersect. The mission of Intersect is to support people at this intersection of faith and mental health through consultation, training, and then fostering collaboration between the faith community and human service providers, which means sometimes we're giving consultation and training to churches who are wanting to know how they can best minister to people with mental health struggles. And some of the stories I'm going to be sharing with you come from that work. Other times, we're providing consultation and training to mental health professionals. Next month, I'm speaking at the Pennsylvania Psychiatric Rehabilitation conference that's going on in PA, and that's just going to be mental health providers. And I'm going to be talking to them about issues of faith and mental health, but it's going to be for them in the same way that there's other times I'm speaking to church audiences. With the fostering collaboration, what that looks like is we help people who are served in the mental health system, people with a lived experience, to get connected to churches or to faith communities of their choice. And other times, we're helping people from churches to get connected to mental health resources in our community. And so sometimes we're doing really macro level work. I'm going to be sharing about that in our first session together. And other times we're doing macro, not micro. I said micro is first. Sometimes macro level work, we're working with whole communities to collaborate, which I'll be getting into. So it's from that space where we have this team of chaplains and team of trainers and consultants that brings me here today to share with you, I hope, insights that are practical for the work you're doing. I don't assume that I have everything to say about this, because I've already been sitting in tables and talking to people who are living at this same intersection, doing this work for a long time. And therefore, I hope at the tables we can gain insights that even the rest of the people in the room can learn from. So the vision that we have in Intersect, and I think a vision that maybe many of you have, is for all people to have access to care and community, that people who were serving in the mental health field would have access to community. And we know that the church can offer a robust version of that, while at the same time hoping people in our churches have access to the care that they so often need. So this is how we're going to be spending our first session together. There's going to be 3 sections to it because I'm a pastor and I think in threes. I wish I could have alliterated this with like 3 Ps, but alas, I did not. First, why churches should collaborate. Second, why mental health providers should collaborate. And third, why the government, civic leaders, should also be involved in this collaborative process. First, why churches should collaborate. A couple of biblical reasons. We've already gotten through some of these, and I think a lot of people here are already bought into this notion, but we do want to start with this basis. Galatians 6:10 says, "Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially those who belong to the family of believers." In other words, we are certainly called in our churches to care for one another as the body of Christ, but that does not mean that we're not also called to go outside of our church to do good to all people. Yes, as Jesus said, to make disciples of all nations, for sure, but part of that process involves the doing of good, the loving neighbor work, that we already heard from in terms of the Good Samaritan example that Laura gave. Also, Psalm 82, and you can go through the Psalms and the prophets and see this repeated over and over again. Defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. And so oftentimes, the people that we serve and walk alongside with mental health struggles fit into this category. Sometimes I'm preaching at churches about ministry to people with mental health struggles, and I'll often preach from Matthew 9, which says Jesus looked out at this crowd of people who were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd, and he looked upon them with compassion. And I think harassed and helpless is one way of describing a lot of people I've known through the years living with mental health conditions. So we're called to do this. Some churches aren't quite at that place where they're sure about this. They want to know, is this really fit with their theology, with Scripture? We actually have a workshop we do called Towards a Biblical View of Mental Illness, because we just want to sit with churches and say, let's talk Bible. Like, we're not trying to skirt this. We believe there's strong theological grounding for doing this work for people made in God's image. As I talk about why we should do that work, I'm going to give you a few different examples, and I have quotes here which won't make sense until I share the context. So get used to quotes that don't make sense for a second today. So I remember this one time there was a person we connected to, a local church, and things were going well. The pastor did a great job at helping this person get connected. But one day I got a call, it was about 11 o'clock at night, from this pastor. And he said, Dave, and I won't say the name, the individual that we connected, his wife called us. And they were now, he and his wife were part of this church. He says, his wife called us. This man has locked himself in the bathroom and he's saying he's going to kill himself. Dave, this feels like it's above my pay grade. What do you think? I share this story because one of the things I think is true as a pastor, Jeff and I were talking about this, is we often need conversation partners. We need people who maybe work in this space of mental health who, when we get to a place where we're going, I'm not sure what's needed right now, we have someone to call. This pastor was really insightful. I don't know that it was above his pay grade, but I do know it helped him to know he had someone he could call as a conversation partner. So one of the valuable reasons for churches to make these connections, to collaborate with the mental health field, is so that you have those conversation partners. I'm going to share a couple more examples of why this is so valuable. One day I got a call from a local pastor. And what he said to me was, Dave, there's a person in my church who's hearing voices, and I'm thinking of asking him not to come back until the voices go away. What do you think? That's a good response. Oh my. That was in my head at that moment, but I didn't say it. That's right. Now, what this sounds like is bad, right? Why would he feel this way? But he had a conversation partner, someone he could call. And what's interesting, and you guys maybe will have a better sense of this than even those of us on the eastern side of the state. What he went on to share was that this had not been too long after the synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh, or the Pittsburgh area. So this pastor was really scared that he wasn't going to be a shepherd who was protecting those in his church body. But he didn't know enough to know, how do you do good risk assessment? And so we sat down with the pastor and with this individual in his church. And the individual in his church said, Pastor, this church is the most helpful thing to me when it comes to my mental health. If I leave here, it's going to make things worse, not better. And the pastor, to his credit, was like, oh, that makes sense. And we were able to help the pastor think through what good risk assessment could look like, as opposed to just saying, maybe don't come back anymore. But I go back to, this is why it's so helpful for us to have conversation partners for us as churches. People in the mental health field, we could call and just say, hey, I'm not sure what to even ask right now, other than this is what I'm feeling. What do you think? Another example, one pastor in our area was telling me one day, it's really helpful to have someone I could call at 3 a.m. when I don't know what I might find. And what he was referring to was a time where a woman in his church called and said, my daughter's talking about suicide, Pastor. Could you come over? I don't know what to do. And so the pastor was driving over at 3 a.m. And what he knew, because of our partnership, was he could call Mobile Crisis at 3 a.m. So he called the Mobile Crisis line, and Mobile Crisis said, we'll be there after you if you need us. You just be the pastor, and we can help figure out if more services are needed. And that's a great collaborative example. The pastor needed to be the pastor. He was bringing something unique in that moment. He had relational trust. But this Mobile Crisis team knew things that pastor didn't about how the system works and how to get emergency support if it was needed. These are some of the reasons why it's so beneficial for churches to be able to have someone in the mental health field that they can collaborate with. Or, as you look at these tables around here, multiple people that you could collaborate with. I've been talking about consultation a lot, but this can also be true for training. I had someone ask me, many people ask me, can someone from your organization do a QPR training for our church? I was actually just in Nashville for an event. And before I left, a pastor came up to me just yesterday. And he said, hey, a woman in my church, she has now had her second son die by suicide. What do I do? And so we talked about, among other things, the value of equipping his church to be able to get help they need to know how to talk with people. Not because this woman or people in the church were bad or it's their fault that this happened, but just so people could get equipped. And so sometimes what's really valuable is for churches to know, who in my community can I reach out to do trainings in things like QPR. That's question, persuade, refer. If you're not familiar with it, it's a suicide intervention training. Or I know some people have used mental health first aid, or we have intersect trainings, or there's other trainings that are out there that can be really helpful to churches, not as sort of a distraction from ministry, but as part of ministry. If this pastor is going to shepherd this woman through the grief that's coming, he's going to be able to bring resources from scripture and from theology. It's going to also be helpful to bring resources from what can be done for people after, post-suicide, for people who are survivors. Another reason to do this comes up in something someone said to me. This was actually from my own church. Person said, how do we let people know about our church's anxiety support group? There's a couple of guys who live with anxiety in my church, and they've started an anxiety support group. And one of the things we were able to say to them was, we actually have partnerships in the mental health field. And just last week, I was calling someone from a mobile psychiatric rehabilitation service saying, hey, there's this peer-led anxiety support group at this church, is this something that people you serve would be interested in? They're like, yes, could you give us any materials about that? It provides your church, if you're doing ministries for people with mental health struggles, if you have those partnerships, you're now getting a pathway into hundreds of people who could benefit from the ministry of your church because you've done that collaborative work ahead of time. Now, this begs the question, if I'm giving you all of these great reasons for why churches should collaborate, why, not all the time, but why sometimes do churches not collaborate? To make my case for why sometimes churches don't, one story, I was asked years ago to lead a discussion between a group of mental health professionals in our county and a group of clergy. And we were talking through things, and about 40 mental health professionals in the room. And one of the pastors stood up and said, I didn't even know you guys existed. And he had been a pastor for many years in this community, but he just didn't somehow, because of the siloing, because of the gap that exists between the faith community and the mental health community, he just never rubbed shoulders. So sometimes it doesn't happen because we're just not intentional. And sometimes it doesn't happen because we haven't met people who can be connectors. And today, there's all sorts of people who can be connectors for you. Trent is a connector for you. Other people here who know both worlds can be connectors, so that it's not the collaborative opportunities aren't happening just because you're not being intentional. It doesn't have to be you seeking everyone out. It might be you finding connectors or talking to people at these tables who can help you do it. But another deeper reason, this is a quote that's an amalgamation of like 18 different people who've said the same thing to me, which is, I don't make referrals of congregants in my church to mental health professionals anymore because I don't know who I could trust. And what they're getting at is they're not sure the mental health professionals will respect the faith of a person that is in their congregation. And I can say, working in the mental health field, that many times they will for their own values about being person-centered and strengths-based, but sometimes they don't. I can understand certain situations of why trust has been broken. But I don't think the answer is just to stay away. I think the answer for you, if you're in a church, is you can actually educate mental health professionals on what you need from them. And there's actually a lot of people, even in our fields of mental health, who are people of faith who are really discouraged to hear this. The head of our adult mental health system in our county is a Christian. And we actually had her at a local symposium where she was like speaking directly to pastors and saying, if you have any situations you run into where people aren't respecting your faith or where you're kept out of meetings that a person we serve wants you in, please come and talk to me. So don't let this be an obstacle for you, because there's a lot of people out there who want to see this collaboration happen. Not just Christians, but even non-Christians who've begun to see the value of collaboration. So we've looked at why should churches collaborate. I now want to talk about why should mental health providers collaborate. Maybe mental health providers among us are like, yes, church, don't you see how much we are valuable to you? And now I want to talk about why it also goes in the opposite direction as well. Some of it's just our own values in the mental health field. We talk about integrated health care. At our table, we were talking about integrated care. Like we talk about integrated health, and we say that, my emotional health impacts my physical health, and my spiritual health impacts my emotional health. And therefore, if we really are integrated humans, then it makes sense that we need to pay attention to the whole person. Access Services, where I work, though Intersect is the Christian division of Access, Access as a whole is no longer identified as a Christian organization. But when I talk to them, I point out that our philosophy of care says that we pay attention to people's social, emotional, physical, and spiritual needs. So if we're going to live out those values, then it just makes sense that we're going to collaborate with faith communities, because that's going to be part of what happens in how we care for people's spiritual needs. I had a therapist not I had a therapist, though that wouldn't be a problem for me to have a therapist. I'm just saying there was a therapist I knew who was serving someone on our caseload. And she said, Dave, can I just call you every time someone mentions God or faith? Because I'm an atheist. And I said, you could. That's one of the benefits of collaboration. But maybe there's ways we can help with some training for you so that you can feel like even if you're serving someone whose faith convictions are different than yours, you still know how to assess those spiritual needs. And so regardless of, if you're a mental health provider, regardless of whether you're a person of faith or not, our own values, our own perspective on integrated health should lead us to both be willing to reach out to others for the sake of people we're serving. But it should also help us to say, how do I become more competent at being able to holistically assess and support the spiritual needs of people, not despite the focus of my work, but because it fits with the focus of my work. It fits with my mission. Another value in the mental health field, in addition to integrated healthcare, is community integration. Right? We say that we want people not just to be individuals receiving our services, not just being consumers or clients or patients or whatever language we're going to use, but to be community members because we believe that's helpful. Think of the social determinants of health and the idea that actually being involved in a community and in your broader community is just good for human flourishing. What Laura was talking about earlier. But over and over again, I found that when I was overseeing a mobile psychiatric rehabilitation program, my responsibility was to sign off on discharge plans. And I will tell you how many times the discharge plan was beautiful, but I knew we were discharging them to nothing. Because I knew that we've done this dance before. And sure, the person, we might be giving them phone numbers, we might be giving them information about resources, but there wasn't substantive connection happening and there was no community there to support the person. And what would often happen is after a few months, the person would come back to us looking for care, not because they still needed our care. They had made a lot of changes and growth, but because we had become their best friend. And some acknowledged that. Which means one of the things we really need to be able to do as mental health providers is connect people to community. And while churches are not the only form of community, they are one of the most concrete expressions of community where people will actually reach out to you when you show up. And I'll share some stories about that later. But discharging people to nothing, as too often takes place, is another reason why we need, as mental health providers, these relationships with faith communities. Another reason, and this probably should have been put first, is simply because people we serve often want that help. There's an individual, I decided once we would lead a spirituality group at our organization, and we call it that because that's language that's accessible within the mental health field, but it was a place where we were saying, how do you bring your resource, how can faith be a resource for your recovery, for your wellness? There were a lot of people there who had actually been in a church and had been wounded in a church, and sometimes they contributed to that wounding in the church. But I remember one of those people said to me, hey, after we had gone through these discussions and sessions, he said, hey, I want to get reconnected to a church. To be honest, my life is lacking meaning and purpose. And I think we know as mental health professionals, if you do not have meaning and purpose in your life, that is going to harm your mental wellness. And so when we were able to connect this man to a local church, it didn't only provide him with friendship, it provided him with a renewed relationship with God. It provided him with spiritual support. It provided him with opportunities to serve. And it provided him, through faith, meaning and purpose. It provided him with hope, not just for today, not just for his mental health, but hope for eternity, that he would live with God forever. That happened, and it wasn't, again, this distraction from good mental health care. It was instead good mental health care because it was accomplishing the purposes that our mental health services are designed to accomplish. Not to mention Medicaid cuts. One of the things that in my organization there, and maybe in some of yours, there's a lot of stress right now about what's going to happen to some of the different programs we have. How much are they going to shrink, or how much might they just not exist if certain Medicaid cuts occur? And I don't want to be a false prophet. I don't know what the future holds. But what I am saying is there's, in my own organization, a lot of conversations with Intersect now, because they're saying, hey, we can't just rely on government funding. How do we build relationships with our community? How do we build relationships with the faith community? Not only because we might need more funding, but because we know we can't do this alone. We've gotten used to thinking, just send people to the mental health system and we'll cover it all. And we're having to think more right now, not only because of our values, but because of funding and regulatory limitations. We need to collaborate for our own ability to sustain our efforts. So, after we've gone through some of those reasons for why mental health providers should collaborate, again, why don't they? And I'm not saying none of them do. What I'm saying is there can be a pattern of it not occurring. And why is that? I want to list a few of those reasons. And I'll take us back to that gathering where I was leading a discussion, moderating a discussion between faith leaders and mental health providers. And if you remember, the faith leader was like, I didn't even know you guys existed. And one of the clinicians came up to me afterwards and they said to me, I have never been part of a conversation like this before. And this was a seasoned clinician who had just never been part of a conversation with people in the faith community before. And so I don't think he's alone. I think there's a lot of people who just think, hey, I'm the one who's dealing with this person and these challenges. Why would I be connecting to a person in a faith community? So why? Why are some of the reasons? Some say religion and politics are the two things you don't discuss in polite company. So some people just go, I don't do this because I don't feel comfortable having this conversation. Right? I'm worried about that. But one of the things that we're going to talk about in our next session is that sharing is different from imposition. You can share, a person can share what they think about the world, where their faith journey has been, without imposing that on somebody else. So I think sometimes fear of talking about religion and politics keeps us from actually having conversations about real life issues that, due to integrated health, actually impact a person's journey. And sometimes we need to pay attention to, is the fear of don't talk about religion and politics, is that because the individual doesn't want to, or because we don't feel comfortable doing that? If the individual doesn't, then by all means don't. We need to be person-centered. We need to meet people where they are. But I've seen a lot of times where a mental health worker goes, I don't want to talk to that person about what they believe. I know what's on TV when I go into their house, and I don't want to talk about it. But if that's the case, then we're putting our own comfort levels above that person's journey of wellness. Another reason, and it's closely connected, people say, I'm concerned I'll overstep my bounds and try to convert them, or they'll try to convert me. In addition to the idea that sharing is different from imposition, conversation is different from conversion. Now, I'm a Christian. I'm a fan of conversion. I think conversion is a beautiful thing where someone without hope finds hope in Jesus. But I will also say, as a mental health worker, I understand that my goal, the reason I'm being paid in the mental health field, is to help someone meet their goals, not my goals for them. But when I do that, if we're talking about their journey, their spiritual needs, just like we're talking about their physical, social, and emotional needs, I don't have to be trying to convert them to have that conversation. It can just be that, a conversation, only if they want to have it with me, and only if it fits with the overall goal of the rehabilitation plan that we've together agreed upon. Another reason some people have given to me, they said, it will make my client's psychosis worse. Because some some workers have worked with individuals who, when they're in a rough place with their mental health, will be saying grand things with faith language, messianic language, let's say. And so it's led us to say, you know what, let's stay away from that because that's unhealthy. The challenge with that way of thinking is that some of the people I know for whom that's a case, they're talking about God on days where they're not doing well, and they're talking about God on days that they are doing well, because God, their faith, matters to them. And so that language is going to come up. I don't want to disparage this. I've had to have conversations with people around how they're expressing themselves with spiritual language, with faith language, how that's being experienced by other people. Sometimes as a fellow person of faith, I've been able to get a hearing with some of those people because they don't want their faith to be harming other people or the way they're talking to be harming other people. But I think if we just look at this one sliver and say, we shouldn't be addressing it then, that I think we might be missing what are the underlying clinical concerns that aren't really faith issues, but are something else. Maybe the most common reason I hear from mental health providers for not collaborating is this one. I feel inadequate. I'm not a spiritual person. Right? They just go like, this is just not my wheelhouse. In fact, in Intersect, we get referrals from other places in our agency. And I'll notice situations where when certain people of faith are working in a program, let's say it's Mobile Crisis, we'll be getting all these referrals. And then they leave to a new job and less referrals occur. And I'm going, are there less people with need, or is it that certain people are going to feel more comfortable with this, so they're more comfortable assessing the need and more comfortable referring the need? And if that's the case, the problem with this perspective is there have been times where people I've served as a social worker have had physical needs. And I've thought to myself, I'm not a nurse. I'm not a doctor. I don't really know a lot about this. But if I were to say, I'm not a nurse, I'm not a doctor, I'm just going to ignore that. I might be ignoring something that's really important given integrated health because there might be, for example, diabetes that's a concern that can impact them in other ways. I can't just ignore it because I'm not a medical professional. And so just like I'm not called to be a nurse for people with their physical needs, mental health providers are not called to be clergy when it comes to people's spiritual needs. We're called to assess these needs, to provide support in the short term, and to help them get connected to other resources. Finally, why government should collaborate. Where does government fit in here? This overlaps in some ways with mental health providers because mental health providers can sometimes be publicly funded. But I've also seen ways where because our mental health systems are within the public square, are often overseen by different regulatory matters, licensing regulations, funding, that's important for also the government to see the value of these sorts of partnerships. A few reasons why. In our own county, Montgomery County, we had some people from the local government coming to us saying, hey guys, a group of pastors came to us asking about what resources exist in our community. Could you guys help us think through how to even have these conversations with them? Because they weren't sure just how to talk pastor. And so they needed some help to think through these relationships and how do we get more word into the broader community? And so we have a coalition now in our county where we're able to, and we'll be getting into that in the second session, where we're able to bring together government leaders, faith leaders and members, and mental health providers so that people can learn about the resources of each other, much like what you guys are doing today. Another reason is we have a homeless crisis in our region. And I was in a conversation with someone working for the government, and they said to me, they were just exasperated. They're like, people keep thinking the government's going to solve homelessness, but we don't have the resources to do it. So they keep getting calls like, hey, there's homeless people on the street. Hey, I'm just meeting someone. She's about to be homeless. What are you going to do? Where's their housing? Where's their funding for this? And the government keeps going, we're kind of at our limit. And so more and more what we're seeing is the government saying to local churches, hey, we need your help. Like, do you guys have any ideas? Like, I was in a meeting with a borough council leader, and he was just like, people are always annoyed at me. Where's the good ideas? We'll take any good ideas you guys have. We have a session tomorrow I'll get into later about bringing churches together to come up with some of those good ideas. But my point in this is, I think government is more and more realizing there's resources out there in the faith community that can help them take some of the pressure off of them to feel like they have to answer all the community problems. And as a church, this is a real open door for us, that the government's beginning to realize our resources are limited. We need more help. And this isn't to say churches aren't already doing great things. There's a lot of things churches are already doing. But one of the things we need to be aware of is, how are we collaborating around those things? I was once talking to someone, he was not a Christian. He was the head of a local foundation. And he said to me, the thing that annoys me about churches is you guys do all this stuff, but you never pay attention to what's already being done. And so it doesn't actually fill gaps that are existing out there, and there's no coordination with it. And so they welcome the help, but they want it to be more coordinated. And for that to happen, we need to learn how to collaborate. This is a group we'll be talking about, our multi-faith coalition. When I say multi-faith, I'll be getting into what I mean by that, a little bit different from interfaith. But it's just an example of people who've come together. There's people there from government, people there from churches, faith communities. There's people there from mental health system. And that's just some of the leaders of this initiative who are trying to do the collaborative work that we've been talking about this morning. But why government doesn't? Why don't they? One, again, is a fear of separation of church and state. And I think separation of church and state is meant to make sure that the church is protected from government overreach so that we have religious liberty. It's meant to protect government from it being taken over by one particular faith. It's not meant to stop collaboration for the common good of our communities. And so I think we need to think a little bit more deeply around how we can complement each other, not take over each other, but complement each other for the common good. And also lack of practice. Some people, I was talking to a colleague of mine who said, we keep getting asked by the government to bring the faith community together because they just don't know how to do it. They know how to speak governmentese. They don't know how to speak faith. Laura was getting into some of those ways in which we sometimes need to be good translators across these divides, because whatever camp we're in, whether we talk mental health, whether we talk faith, or whether we talk government, not everyone talks like us. And doing this work of collaboration requires that. I'll be getting into that in the next session on the how. For now, what I want to do is take some time for us to do breakout discussion. And so let's take a moment, and for now I'll say 10 minutes, and discuss these three questions. I'll quickly name them. What reasons for collaboration do you find most compelling, and why? Maybe it's been one of the reasons I gave. Maybe it's a reason that came to you that I didn't list, but that says to you, you know what? I need to be about this. And maybe you already are, and this is a reminder to just get yourself in the headspace to go, yeah, this is why, and this is the reason I'll share with other people. Second, what concerns you most about collaborating across sectors? Again, maybe it was one of the reasons I gave. Maybe it's something that I didn't name, but what really concerns you? And maybe we can, during some time of unpacking it, maybe we can even speak to those. And third, how would you go about making a case for collaboration within the church or organization where you attend or work? Maybe you're here going, well, I'm buying into this, but back at the ranch, they wouldn't. How do you go back to the ranch and talk to them about this? So let's take 10 minutes for conversation. Break.